Hello and welcome to General Biology at Rogers State University. It's good to see you this week, and we're continuing our Unit 3 discussion on ecology, kind of some general concepts of ecology. Last week we talked about populations. Remember, we said that populations are groups of organisms of the same species in a particular area. Populations of bluegill, perch in a pond, or population of crappie in a lake, all the same species in a certain area. That's what we call a population. Well, here in chapter 38, we want to expand that to a broader view that involves multiple populations of plants, animals, fungus, bacteria living together in what we call a community. And so that's what we're starting here in chapter 38. So remember, we saw this chart in last semester. Last week we said that in ecology we have a hierarchy of organization, or levels of organization, just like we do at the cellular level and just like we do at the molecular level as well. But these are based on organisms. Organisms are a particular species grouped together in a certain area are populations, but then broader views are communities, multiple populations interacting with each other, and then ecosystems are even larger versions of communities. Sometimes it's kind of hard to describe the difference between the two, but this graph on the verbiage on the left does a pretty good job. A community includes all of the populations of multiple species in the same region, whereas an ecosystem is all the biotic and abiotic aspects, the chemicals that are important to life: nitrogen, carbon, hydrogen, or water. So ecosystems are simply a kind of a higher scale, a higher hierarchy than communities. And this is the hierarchy of understanding. So let's talk a little bit about communities and ecosystems. We'll kind of use them interchangeably. You've heard this term a lot called a niche. You hear it oftentimes in common media of what a niche is. Hey, fill your niche, or perform your niche, grow in your niche. Well, ecologically speaking, every organism, plant, animal, fungus, bacteria, has a niche. Sometimes in ecology we refer to it this way, that it's the role that an organism plays in its community or in its ecosystem. This definition here, it includes interactions with all other organisms, as well as abiotic aspects of the environment. It's the role that an organism plays in an ecosystem or in its community. There's a lot of interactions that go on, as you would suspect, in communities. Populations, organisms don't live in isolation. It kind of goes without saying. We always interact with other organisms in our environment. So this brings up a lot of different types of interactions. There's competition, where it's going to benefit one and harm another. What we call, or in this case, well, I'm sorry, reading this, competition kind of harms both. Well, we're going to talk about that in a minute. It enhances both, but can harm both as well. There's mutualism, where there's a mutual benefit between two different organisms. There's commensalism, where one benefits and one is simply not affected, what we call a plus zero interaction. Then there's different kinds of interaction, parasitism, herbivory, predation, that we want to talk about. All of these are just interactions that occur within communities. Don't just get isolated on humans. And don't just get isolated on animals, plants, fungus, bacteria as well. Well, competition occurs. Classic definition of a competition: it's when two or more species are trying to access a resource that is in limited supply. The key point there is it's kind of in a limited supply, a limited resource. If it was completely abundant and highly abundant, it wouldn't really be competition. It's competition for a resource that is in limited supply. Usually it's food, nutrition. Oftentimes it's nesting space. Barn owls nesting in human provided habitats. Black bears competing for denning sites in low water hardwood forests. Sometimes it's competition for a mate. Uh, what we call ungulate animals, hoofed animals. Oftentimes there's very severe competition for mates between males and males. Not often between females and females, but males and males competing to breed in a harem. So competition can be more than just food. There's a lot of different types of competition. Usually we say here it's a negative consequence on both species, um, but in some cases it actually produces evolutionary traits that enhance their competitive value in an ecosystem. Um, a very important statement here at the very bottom of this slide. Two species cannot coexist indefinitely in the same niche. Think about that for a second, especially two highly competitive species. They can't occupy the same niche. In fact, we call this the competitive exclusion principle. You know, one competitor is going to win, and there's going to be a winner and a loser if two organisms occupy the same niche at the same time. In this case here, these are barnacles. Barnacles trying to occupy the same niche. When only one species is there's no competition. But if there's another species involved here, then competition occurs and limiting happens here. These two barnacle types, they cannot exist in the same niche at the same time. Somebody's going to win, somebody's going to lose, or we're going to push somebody into different habitats, what we call the competitive exclusion principle. There's what we call symbiotic relationships. You've heard the term symbiosis passed around. Symbiotic relationships is when two individuals live in a close proximity to each other, sometimes on each other. They use each other they grow. You've heard these terms before, that there's mutualism. Um, Mutualism is where there's a mutual benefit of these two species living close together. The classic example is Nemo, or the anemone fish that lives within the tentacles of sea anemones. Sea anemones are cnidarians, where they have stinging and not necessarily poison, but stinging tentacles that is enhanced by skin or oil or chemicals on other fish or echinoderms. But the sea anemone lacks those chemicals and doesn't stimulate these nematocysts to be expelled from sea anemones. They're immune to it, so they can kind of hide within the sea anemone tentacles. And the benefit, well, they can hide where other organisms can't hide. They can live where other organisms can't live. These anemone fish, what we call clownfish. There's some discussion among ecologists about, well, what does the sea anemone benefit from this? Well, there's some thought that maybe the anemone fish, clownfish, attracts other predators or other fish, other competitors, and that's how anemones benefit from this. But both animals protect or benefit from this relationship. A commensalistic relationship is kind of ecologists kind of wonder if this actually happens or occurs in nature. It's when one species benefits from the relationship, but there's not really a significant effect on the other species. They do live close together, mosses on tree trunks, benefiting from an increased level of sunlight. There's There's some debate among ecologists as to whether this really truly occurs in nature. If it does, it doesn't occur very often, what we call a commensalistic relationship. And then you're probably more familiar with a parasitic relationship, where one species definitely has a benefit, whereas another species is harmed. That's what we call a plus minus relationship, where two organisms, parasitic worms, we've talked about those in the past. Parasitic worms, probably the most classic example here. But parasites that live in or on organisms. There's social parasites like brown-headed cowbirds that will lay their eggs in another bird's nest and allow the other bird to hatch and raise its young, what's called social parasitism. Brown-headed cowbirds are classic parasitizers. But in this kind of a relationship, one species benefits, the other one is harmed. Now, if the parasite harms its host to such an extent that it dies, then it loses its host. It loses its ability to survive. So most parasites don't necessarily outright kill their host. The host may die from secondary infections or there's some type of complications, but most parasites don't necessarily kill their hosts outright. Roundworms, flatworms, we've talked about those in the past, are classic examples of parasites. There's a lot of different feeding relationships. They're not necessarily symbiotic relationships where two organisms live close together. These are actual feeding relationships, and herbivory is a classic feeding relationship. Predation is a classic feeding relationship. Sometimes we can classify herbivory, feeding on herbs, feeding on plants. That's kind of a predatory relationship. So sometimes these can become vague, but herbivores consume plants. There's a lot of different types of, folivory, where feeding on leaves, granivory, feeding on grains, herbivory, feeding on plants. So we can actually even scale this down even smaller into different groups. But herbivory is feeding on plants. Now, if you're going to feed on plants, you have to be able to deal with some things. Remember, we talked about cellulose. That is the primary component of cell walls. It's a very starchy component of cell walls of every plant cell. Well, and we can't digest it as humans. We can't digest cellulose. But if you're going to be an herbivore feeding on plants only, you better have some way to digest cellulose. And so they do. They have ways to break down that cellulose and actually extract nutrients from it. Predators, on the other hand, actually actively hunt and feed on other animals. Usually, the classic example of the predator-prey relationships of wolves and elk, and wolves and caribou, wolves and moose. The top-down predators: wolves, mountain lions, bears. Predatory relationships, and birds oftentimes are predatory. Raptors are predatory. So these are predator-prey relationships that we often talk about in ecology. We talk about coevolution a little bit. Sometimes the text here says adaptations can be in one species, can actually aid adaptations in another species. It's where two species they co-evolve with each other. They become dependent on each other. Crossbills and lodgepole pines here. Being a bat biologist and a cave biologist, I talk a lot about bats in the tropics, especially, that will feed on plants, the nectar in flowering plants, and they co-evolve. The nectar from plants with the certain cactuses will certain cacti have evolved with certain bat pollinators in the desert Southwest, saguaro cactus, other cacti. Many insects have co-evolved with plants where they will can only pollinate certain plants, and only certain plants are pollinated by certain pollinators. It's what I call coevolution. Um, Scientists, especially ecologists, use two terms that are very important. One, and we're going to talk a little bit more about it in the next couple of chapters. One is called species richness, and another one is called species evenness. Species richness is the number of organisms that comprise a certain area. It's what we call richness. Rich environments have a lot of species. The richer, the better. The richer, the more diverse. And biodiversity is good. And so we rank different areas of the earth based on their biodiversity. So richness, the more number of species, the more rich an environment is. Evenness. Well, evenness is how many individuals are in each of those species. So these two factors combined show up in what we call the measurement of biodiversity. As you would imagine, the tropics are highly diverse, very diverse, multiple numbers of populations of organisms and high numbers of individuals in each population. It's richness plus evenness, and that builds biodiversity. Some of the least diverse areas of the earth are the Arctic, the poles, Arctic and Antarctic areas, tundra, high mountain alpine areas, not so much desert areas as you might think. They have a little bit more diversity than you think. And then of course the tropics are have high diversity. Since we're talking about food and we're talking about parasitism, predation, predatory relationships, herbivory, this is what we call trophic levels. It's a position that an organism has in a food chain, beginning here with decomposers that decompose nutrients. We've talked a little bit about this: bacteria, fungi that will break down materials, return them to the soil and inorganic nutrients, phosphorus, carbon, nitrogen. But then it grows back, usually in primary producers. Let's talk a little bit about these. These are what we call trophic levels. There are primary producers. These are mostly plants. They're the primary producers. They grow, and then you have consumers that will feed on the primary producers. These are any organisms that feed on plants, usually eating each other, what we call heterotrophs. We've talked about that before. Then there's secondary consumers that will feed on primary consumers. And then there's high level consumers at the top of this. And we often call those keystone species. They're at the top of the food chain in their area. In the grasslands, the vast grasslands of North America, the bison were the primary keystone species. They drove all other trophic levels. Now we might say, well, there were wolves at one time that fed on bison. Well, yeah, and they were kind of the keystone predators at one point, but not any longer. Keystone species are not necessarily the top predator. Don't think of it that way. Keystone species are the most important at maintaining diversity in a community. In this case, it was bison. With 60 million bison living on the plains at one time, they were a keystone species. Every other aspect of the community depended on bison. We can see this in other aquatic communities as well. There's usually one particular species that everybody else depends on for survival in a community or in an ecosystem. We have to talk about this when we talk about ecosystems. Now we're a little broader, a little bigger than just communities, and ecosystems. We talk about abiotic aspects in ecosystems, non-living, abiotic, non-living aspects of ecosystems. And when we talk about this, we talk about chemicals that cycle through ecosystems. These are going to be very familiar to you. The water cycle, the carbon cycle, the nitrogen cycle, and to a lesser extent, the phosphorus cycle. But these nutrients, these chemicals cycle through ecosystems and are very important in their content, and the level at which they participate in these ecosystems. The water cycle being probably the most important, as you might imagine. Water enters the atmosphere through evaporation. Desert environments like where I live now, high rates of evaporation, high evaporates. In fact, in desert ecosystems where I live, the evaporation rate exceeds the precipitation rate. You can measure evaporation, you can measure precipitation, and in deserts, much higher evaporates than precip rates. Now, where you live in Oklahoma, Arkansas, where you get maybe 50 inches of rain a year, then obviously, and it's very humid, the evaporate is lower and the precip rate is higher. Here, where I live in western Colorado, we receive maybe 8 inches of rain a year, but the evaporate, low humidities, far exceed that. But water evaporates in the atmosphere. Eventually, water returns to the earth in the form of precipitation, and then it accumulates in oceans and freshwater systems, and then it's just a water cycle. It's very important. It's essential to the functioning of ecosystems. The carbon cycle. You hear a lot about carbon, especially carbon dioxide, CO2. You hear a lot about it now in the impacts on climate change. We used to call it global warming, but in some cases, climate change actually results in extreme temperature cycles. So it's not necessarily, it might be warming for some people, but it's extreme cold for others. But it's climate change, and the impact of CO2 accumulation, excess CO2 accumulation in the atmosphere compared to past history. But carbon does cycle through an ecosystem, through ecosystems. It accumulates in the atmosphere. It filters its way into organisms, and then it's released back into the atmosphere. It's what we call the carbon cycle. It's essential. Carbon is, remember we talked about this several months ago, how carbon is important in almost every aspect of organic molecules. Remember we said that's one of the definitions of an organic molecule is that it contains carbon, and how it cycles from the atmosphere to the soil, accumulating in organisms, and then filters back to the soil or back to the atmosphere is very important. Now, the aspect of global warming is that it's accumulating much faster as we burn fossil fuels. There's higher content of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere than there has been in thousands and thousands of years. And so we feel like that's impacting global climate. And quite controversial, as you might imagine, politically, not scientifically, but politically. The nitrogen cycle, we've talked a little bit about this. It's very important that nitrogen is one of the highest accumulating elements in the atmosphere. Remember we said the atmosphere is about 77% nitrogen, about 22% oxygen, a lot more nitrogen in the atmosphere than there is oxygen. So, but you and I simply breathe that in and breathe it out. We don't get to use that kind of nitrogen. Instead, we rely on organisms to change atmospheric nitrogen into nitrogen that can be consumed by you and I so that we can use it in our bodies. And we rely on decomposers, we rely on bacteria, we rely on organisms to do that. Legumes are very important in doing that. Vegetables or foods that are legumes are very important nitrogen fixers. In their roots, they have bacteria that convert nitrogen in the atmosphere, atmospheric nitrogen, into nitrogen that you and I can use as we consume it. And very important in proteins. Remember, we talked about how important proteins are. Nitrogen is essential to forming of proteins in your body and nucleic acids in your body, but we can't use it as we inhale it. We have to use it after it's been changed by what we call nitrogen fixers, and then we can consume it to be used in our bodies. What we call nitrogen fixation. It's called nitrification, where bacteria will convert NH4 into NH3 or some other form of nitrogen that we can actually use in our bodies and in our diet. We'll end up right here in just the last couple of minutes where sometimes nutrients can accumulate too much, especially in aquatic systems and especially in freshwater aquatic systems. If you have the opportunity to observe ponds, especially small ponds, over maybe on your property, maybe on your grandparents' property or your parents' property over a period of 30, 40 years, you know what's happening here. It's what we call eutrophication. It's how excess nutrients will accumulate in freshwater systems in particular. And what those nutrients do is they cause a bloom of growth. But over time, this bloom of growth will negatively impact the aquatic system. It's what we call eutrophication. Usually it's nitrogen or phosphorus that is being placed into a system in a high amount, especially in areas where there's a lot of nitrogen and phosphorus applications. Those of you that live in eastern Oklahoma, hopefully you're a little bit of aware of this and how the increase of chicken production in eastern Oklahoma and western Arkansas, the application of chicken waste as a fertilizer on crops, on grasslands, they get leached through rainfall into aquatic systems, especially streams. They then accumulate in lakes, and water quality is significantly impacted. It's what we call, they increase or magnify the rate of natural eutrophication. Significant lawsuit by the state of Oklahoma suing the state of Arkansas was just resolved in the last year in the U.S. federal court in Tulsa, where the streams in eastern Oklahoma, like the Illinois River, the Barren Fork River, other tributaries, Spavinaw Creek, were significantly impacted by excess runoff of nutrients from the application of chicken manure. That magnified this eutrophication process where algae now grows and blooms and begins to grow and kind of filter out sunlight. And so basically we have an over accumulation of plant life and a consumption of oxygen in these systems. And so, the outcome of that lawsuit was kind of murky, not to use a play on words there, but was rather varied. But companies and agriculture now have the EPA in Oklahoma, the DEQ in Oklahoma has established some guidelines on how much application can occur per acre, trying to limit the over application of nitrogen that gets introduced back into our freshwater resources. And these were very prominent resources in eastern Oklahoma. If you fish or swim in Spavinaw Creek or the Illinois River or Lake Tenkiller, your very Little Creek, Little Lee Creek and Lee Creek in eastern Oklahoma, these were very important natural resources in eastern Oklahoma that were significantly impacted by this hyper-eutrophication process or input of nitrogen and phosphorus into our soils.